In 1983, a team of scientists conducted a radical experiment. This experiment had place in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without any access to senses or ways to perceive a simulation would be able to perceive the presence from God. They believed that the five senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who had claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists had performed a very complex operation in which every sensory nerve that was connected to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate or even sense the outside world, he was all alone with his thoughts. The scientists monitored him as he spoke out loud about his state of mind. As he spoke, it was very jumbled and slurred. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. And 2 days later, the man had cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking to him. And what's more impressive is that he could talk back. The scientists were intrigued, but they were not convinced. Not until the subject started to name dead relatives of theirs. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. And at this point, a sizable portion of the scientists had left the study. After spending an entire week talking to the dead, the subject became very distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his conscience was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit himself a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives so that he could at least escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for a couple of days, but then he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see the dead in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functioning eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said that the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the ends of the world. And at one point, he wouldn't stop yelling. And all he said was, "No heaven, no forgiveness." And this would go on for 5 hours straight. He continuously begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was very close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his forearm. The scientists rushed to the test chamber and restrained him to the table so that he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to constant crying. Eventually, he would turn his head, and despite being blind, he could make eye contact with the scientists. And one of the new entries had the misfortune of locking eyes with him. In doing so, the subject whispered, "I have spoken with God, and He has abandoned us." And that's when his vitals stopped. There was no apparent cause of death. He just died. I thought I was prepared to die, but I'm not so sure anymore.